Hello and welcome to the screencast. This is the Social Distancing and Remote Learning volume, episode 3 on images and imagism. This presentation is to help set up the modern unit in my Brit-Lit class, but it also relates to the general study of poetry and poetry writing, and so I hope people will find it useful for a number of things. Standard warning about the scruffiness of this episode. I probably won't have time to go through and tidy it up very much before it has to go online, but I hope you do enjoy it. Abby the Wonder Dog is here, so you might hear her rummaging around and a cat might come in. That's just part of the fun. Before we get into imagism, we need to talk about images a bit. If you've seen my screencasts on imagery and poetry writing, these will be review for you, but if you have not, we do need to kind of do an overview here just so people know what's going on with the actual movement when we get to it. Most people are used to thinking of images and imagery in terms of pictures. But if you're going to talk about poetry, really, if you're going to talk about any kind of writing, you have to be able to talk about images. The challenge is how to talk about them. And the thing is, there are lots of ways of defining images. You can call them word pictures that use sensory detail to provoke a physical sensation and often associated memories. You can talk about them as the rendering of your bodily experience in the world. You can talk about them as the engine of a poem. Whichever definition you use, and for my students we're using that first one, you also have to talk about imagery, which is the use of images in a poem, or really any piece of artwork. The term imagery is also often used to describe coherent patterns of images in an artwork, and that's where my students are going to be landing. An image is an example of imagery, but really we'll be looking at patterns mostly as we're going through the individual texts we're going to be looking at for the next couple of weeks. And finally, you can also talk about imagery as how your poetry will become an experience for the reader rather than simply talk about an experience. And this relates to, again, something I've talked about before, which is a mantra of really any creative writing teacher, but it shows up a lot with poetry writing teachers particularly, is you need to show rather than tell when you're doing higher quality writing. You can use images in lots of different ways in a piece of writing, as you can see here, and this is by no means an exclusive or absolute list. If you want more on that, that's where you should go into the more detailed screencast. But there are a couple of basics of images besides the definition that we do need to cover. And that is that there are two kind of basic classes or categories of images, which are that they can be literal and they can be figurative. Literal images are what they are. They are literal descriptions of a thing. What it is, how it smells, what it feels like, and so on. The emphasis is on the sensory experience of whatever it is that's being described, like her bright fingernails polished red, white lines on fresh blacktop, or outside the second grade room, the jacaranda tree blossomed. Sometimes literal images work because you, the audience, the reader, recognize what is being referenced and can picture it. It calls up a visual and an associated experience in your head. Sometimes that might not work, as for example with that jacaranda tree. If you don't know what one looks like or smells like, then that image doesn't resonate. But if you do, you get the visual, you get the scent, maybe you even get a sense of the place outside that second grade classroom. Or maybe just the idea of a flowering tree outside the classroom gets you thinking about the flowering crabapple or the magnolia tree outside your second grade classroom when you were a kid growing up. And really, whichever one of those things happens, that means that the image is working. It's evoking a sensory detail and the memories that are associated with the thing. Figurative images are everything that literal images aren't. There are hundreds of figures of speech, and so this is a complicated category of images. We're just going to keep it simple here. So here are those 3 examples, and I kind of did that first one parallel to the literal one so you can get a combination. Rather than her fingernails painted red, you've got her lips hard as polished fingernails. That's using a simile, comparing two unlike things to create a new sense or understanding of a thing. Falling in love is a metaphor. You don't actually fall. Nothing happens. You don't go crash. You don't go boom. But the figure of speech helps to create the emotional understanding of the experience. And then this is a phrase that we use in our house every once in a while, is we have commando kittens, when they just kind of go rampaging around the house and strike from ambush and like that. They're not actually commandos. They have nothing to do with commandos, but that's how we talk about them. That, again, is a metaphor. So if you remember our jacaranda blossom, I'm going to go back to that poem now and read you a little bit more of it. Outside the second grade room, the jacaranda tree blossomed into purple lanterns. That metaphor of comparing the jacaranda blossoms to purple lanterns helps you to see them in a whole new way. It transforms them into more than merely just the blossom. The blossom itself is an image, but then the next line of the poem transforms the image into another image and gives it a greater sense of resonance and depth. Here's another example of some figurative imagery. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore? There's more to this poem by Langston Hughes, but this is enough to give you an idea. Hughes's figurative images, these are similes, give you a really visceral sense of the frustration that African Americans felt after the promise of the Harlem Renaissance was snuffed out by the Great Depression and the out-and-out racism that still pervaded American society in the 1950s, which is when he wrote that poem. The dried-up raisin in the sun is not a particularly ugly image, although it's not the most pleasant one in the world. And the sore, which he goes on to describe in even greater detail, is an actively unpleasant one. You get a sense of corruption and rot and disease at the heart of things in the country. Sometimes images can be both literal and figurative. Once, if an owl hooted on the hill, if a male ape leaped and loped out there on the jackfruit bough in our yard, my poor heart would melt for fear. But now, in the difficult dark of night, nothing can stay its wandering on the long, sloping mountain ways of his coming. There are little images in that poem. The ape is an ape, and the jackfruit is a jackfruit, and that is what you're seeing here. You're technically seeing a monkey, not an ape. But those are jackfruit that monkey's gnawing on. So they are actual, just straight up literal images. In Tamil poetry, these also have a figurative value. These are figures of speech that are understood within the Tamil culture. So I got to do a little explaining to you here so you know what's going on. In Tamil culture, apes figuratively represent male sexuality. And the jackfruit, which is a pretty big fruit, is full of a honey-like nectar. Those often represent the heroine in a Tamil poem. So while this is literally a poem with an ape jumping around in a tree, it is also a figurative poem whose imagery suggests sexual anxiety, a mix of fear and desire on the part of the speaker. Now that we've done a review of images and imagery, I think it's safe for us to move on to Imagism itself. Imagism is an early 20th century English and American movement. It is a reaction against the Romantic and the Victorian periods, what were seen as the excesses and wrong-headedness of those periods. That's not to say it was, that's just how the people, the writers, poets in the early 20th century felt about it. And it had really three main points of emphasis, which were avoid abstraction, no excess language, and rhythmic freedom. Ezra Pound, who was one of the founders of Imagism, said in his essay, A Few Don'ts, that poets should go in fear of abstractions. William Carlos Williams, one of the most important American imagists, wrote in his poem Patterson that there should be no ideas but in things. Williams never explained his line, though there's been a lot of fighting about its meaning since he wrote it, but Pound went on quite a bit about what he meant. In their purest forms, Imagist poems are made up of really nothing but images, one after another. Imagist poets didn't like, and some of them actively disdained, big sweeping generalizations or assertions about emotional states like love or sorrow or delight, because those really don't mean anything, because they can mean so many different things to so many different people. They're vague, they're blobby, they're ambiguous, and these poets wanted to avoid that. Imagist poems may indicate what they're about in their titles or in a couple of lines that set up or resolve the poem, but for the most part, what you're going to find are poems that are filled with the most concrete and specific images that you will ever read, or if you're interested in writing on them in this form, write. Imagists hated excess language. They tend to strip down their poems to their spare, bare essence. In their purest form, some of the poems are nothing but a series of images. As part of this mandate to cut out excess language, you may run into sentence fragments. They will sometimes eliminate conjunctions, so you get a kind of janky rhythm sometimes to the poem. Sometimes you get direct juxtaposition of images without any connective material. And like Pound says here, everything in the poem has to do something, and if it doesn't, you get rid of it. Imagists preached a doctrine of rhythmic freedom. Romantics said they'd do this, but a lot of them didn't. If you don't believe me, have a look at pretty much anything by Keats and Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey for examples. Both of those writers tended to use meter and structured lines, even though they tended to talk about setting rules and codes in abeyance. For the part of the Imagists, what this means is that there are no fixed line lengths, there are no set meters, no rhythmic patterns that they had to follow, and stanza structure is completely open as well. That didn't mean that they couldn't use these or that they wouldn't use these when they wanted to. It's just that they regarded them as tools to achieve particular effects rather than things you had to do slavishly because that was the way orthodoxy required you to do it. The poem's formal elements are not established ahead of time. They are discovered by the poet through the act of composition and revision. So what does all of this mean? Go in fear of abstraction, use no superfluous words, and rhythmic freedom. Let's have a look at a poem by William Carlos Williams to have an idea. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Now I know some of you are getting angry because you're looking at that poem and you're thinking that poem isn't about anything. It doesn't do anything that poem should do. It's vague and it's frustrating and it doesn't reveal itself. Before we get into that, it's important to understand the Imagists did not always agree with each other. In fact, they argued quite a bit. Pound, whom I've been quoting from a lot, turned his back on the movement he helped start because of Amy Lowell's ideas about Imagism. They made him nuts, basically. Lowell herself eventually moved on as well. Some Imagist poets believe that their readers will understand the emotions or situations that are rendered in a poem if the poets do their job well. Other Imagists believe that what the poet thinks or feels doesn't matter. What matters is that the reader has an authentic emotional reaction after reading the poem. Overall, though, Imagists believe that the real poem was suggested by the poem on the page. The poem is a gateway into a much bigger emotion that we may not understand, that we can only glimpse at or guess at. That brings us to an idea that's super important for pretty much all of 20th century poetry, which is the idea of the objective correlative. The objective correlative is an outward set of objects, a situation, or a chain of events corresponding to an inward experience and evoking this experience in the reader. So something that exists out there in the world, whether it is a thing or an event or a series of events, connects to something that you have felt internally. And through the rendering of this object or situation or series of events, the poem and the poet can evoke an experience like it in the reader. The term was coined by T.S. Eliot, who himself uses objective correlatives and was heavily influenced by the Imagists and their beliefs. If this helps, maybe think about Williams's poem this way. What situation would make a person think that so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens? What is it that would make this scene so important or significant? For my part, I don't know for sure. Contentment, maybe. Peace, relief. Someone desperate to get outside after being cooped up with a serious illness. That's something I think all of us can understand right now. The concrete images in the poem suggest these things. They hint at them, but the poem doesn't tell, and that's actually okay, because it allows you to make the understanding of the poem more concretely your own. I know that is frustrating for a lot of people who are used to there being a meaning for a thing. And some of these poets did believe that there was a meaning for the thing. It was their job to reveal it, and if you, the reader, didn't get it, then you're either insufficient at being a reader, or they were insufficient at being a poet. Others of the Imagists believed that their job was to evoke a feeling and allow it to blossom inside of you, rather than just telling you what to think about a thing. So whether Williams is about contentment, or peace, or relief, or desperation to get outside when you are cooped up inside, it really, in a way, doesn't matter at all. It's how you and the poem enter into the world together. Here's some more examples that I'm also going to kind of talk you through. This is Sea Rose by H.D. Rose, harsh rose, marred and with stint of petals, meager flower, thin, spare of leaf, more precious than a wet rose single on a stem. You are caught in the drift. Stunted, with small leaf, you are flung on the sand. You are lifted in the crisp sand that drives the wind. Can the spice rose drip with such acrid fragrance hardened in a leaf? The title is simple, Sea Rose. Like a lot of Imagist poem titles, is descriptive, but not much more. Stanza 1 is really made up of simple, literal images. If you look at it, sometimes people would say it doesn't even seem like a poem because it's not all fancy language. A couple of the words are a little high-end, stint of petals, meager flower. But really, there's nothing in here that's going to pose that many problems for pretty much any reader who comes wandering across this thing. Stanza 2 continues the description from stanza 1, and it uses a simple comparison. It's not a simile or a metaphor here, it's just a comparison to a wet rose single on a stem. More precious, in line 5, is really the only real value judgment in the entire poem, which is starting to tell the reader how important the sea rose is, beyond the fact that the poet is choosing to pay attention to the thing in and of itself. Stanza 3 is another series of images that describe the size of the sea rose and a couple things that can happen to it. Again, nothing really quote-unquote poetic about this, other than the fact that you've got really crisp, simple, literal images carving out what's going on in the scene that the poet is looking at. And then stanza 4 is a question, comparing sea roses, which are wild, to spice roses, which are grown in gardens. The comparison suggests that spice roses aren't as good as sea roses, despite the kind of ratty, beat-up state that the sea roses exist in. On a larger, kind of meaningful scale, the poem, I guess, is asking us to pay attention to the grubby, to the meager, because there's beauty and significance there, too. Maybe even more beauty and more significance than there is in the big, showy garden roses that we're all used to seeing. This is a poem by Ezra Pound called The Encounter. All the while they were talking the new morality, her eyes explored me. And when I rose to go, her fingers were like the tissue of a Japanese paper napkin. Title of the poem, just like the other ones, super simple. This one just states the situation that the poem is going to be describing. The first line sets up the situation. Line 2 is really just a simple action, but it's using a really, really carefully chosen verb, explored. If you think of all the different verbs a person could use in a situation like this and how different this is from just saying, writing something like, she looked at me, you get an idea of what Pound was actually talking about when he was talking about don't use any word that doesn't reveal something. Line 3 is a transitional line, and it's setting up the simile that's coming in lines 4 and 5. And the simile itself is just gorgeous and specific. Her fingers were like the tissue of a Japanese paper napkin. Little side note here, Japanese poetics were a huge influence on the Imagists. They loved haiku in particular, and so it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of the poems that you see from the Imagists, the United States and Britain from the early 20th century, do have a very kind of clear resemblance, both in their structure and in their language, to haiku from traditional Japanese culture. On a larger level, the poem is contrasting what they are discussing to what happens in the little encounter. So you've got this big new morality versus this kind of little micro moment in these people's lives. You don't know what the speaker and the woman are thinking. You don't know what happened afterward, and that really is part of the point of the poem, to suggest the emotions and complications around the situation and allow the reader to live in that kind of ambiguous moment. New morality maybe suggests that something illicit is going on or might have been starting, but it's really unclear whether that's so, and I don't know whether that's even ever a totally answerable thing. I mean, I know you can obviously answer it and you can make an argument different ways, but I don't know anyone's ever going to be like right about the thing. And that's one of the things that I really love about the Imagist poems is it's a kind of simultaneous specificity and concreteness with an openness that allows you to come at it and understand it from a variety of different directions. That's a lot to cover in a session, and we covered it pretty quick. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it helpful. Like with the others, I'll be putting up a bibliography when I get the screencasts all sorted out. First, though, I got to get to work on another one on modernism and Yeats and the Second Coming. So I'm going to get going on that. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I will be talking with all of you soon.